the fuse that could count. Washington Naval Gun Factory, 1942. Ensign Walter Prine had studied electrical engineering for exactly long enough to be recruited, in the spring of 1942, into a project so tightly compartmentalized that the officer who first briefed him refused, even in a locked and windowless room, to write the project's actual purpose on any piece of paper that could later be traced back to the conversation. "What I am about to describe to you," said Commander Aldous Merrin, the officer overseeing Walter's induction into the project, "is, in my own professional judgment, quite possibly the single most tightly guarded technical secret currently held by the United States government, considerably more sensitive, at least in terms of the immediate and irreversible advantage its compromise would hand to the enemy, than certain other efforts you may have heard rumors about in the more excitable corners of the officers' mess. I want you to understand, before I explain a single technical detail, that everything discussed in this room falls under a security classification. I am not permitted to describe to you in any greater specificity than to say that a single captured, intact example of what we are building could, in the hands of competent German or Japanese engineers, be reverse engineered within a matter of months into an equivalent weapon of their own, and that this single fact governs, and will continue to govern for the remainder of your service on this project, nearly every operational decision made about where and how the finished weapon is actually permitted to be used in combat." What Merrin went on to describe over the following hour struck Walter, who had, by his own later admission, expected something considerably more exotic given the extraordinary secrecy surrounding it, as at once elegantly simple in its underlying concept and staggeringly difficult in its actual engineering execution. A fuse fitted to the nose of an ordinary anti-aircraft artillery shell, containing a miniature radio transmitter and receiver capable of detecting, through the reflection of its own broadcast signal off a nearby aircraft, the precise moment the shell passed close enough to that aircraft to cause maximum destructive effect from the shell's fragmentation pattern, and of triggering the shell's detonation at exactly that moment, rather than relying, as every previous generation of anti-aircraft ammunition had been forced to rely, on a mechanical or electrical timer set before firing, calculated from an estimate of the target's distance and speed that was, in the actual chaotic conditions of real anti-aircraft combat, very often wrong by a margin more than sufficient to render the shell's detonation entirely harmless to the aircraft it had been fired at. The shell, in effect, counts down its own approach to the target, using its own broadcast radio signal as a kind of miniature radar set small enough and rugged enough to survive being fired from an artillery piece, Merrin explained. This is not, I want to emphasize, merely an improvement on existing anti-aircraft technology. It represents, if we can make it reliably functional in actual combat conditions, something considerably closer to an entirely new category of weapon ammunition that adjusts its own point of detonation in real time, based on its own actual proximity to the target, rather than any advanced calculation that inevitably grows less accurate the more any of the underlying assumptions about target speed, altitude, or evasive maneuvering turn out to be wrong. The problem of surviving the gun itself. The engineering difficulty Walter found himself assigned to help solve in the months that followed his induction into the project proved to be a problem considerably more demanding than the fuse's basic underlying concept might have suggested. Not the challenge of building a miniature radio transceiver small enough to fit inside an artillery shell's nose. Difficult though that alone would have been using the vacuum tube technology available in the early 1940s. But the far more brutal challenge of building such a device rugged enough to survive the specific and genuinely extraordinary physical violence of being fired from a naval anti-aircraft gun in the first place. You must understand the actual forces involved, explained Dr. Elena Voss, a physicist on the project whose patient, methodical explanations Walter came to rely on heavily during his early months of work. When an artillery shell is fired from a modern naval gun, the acceleration experienced by anything inside that shell in the fraction of a second it takes to travel the length of the gun barrel reaches many hundreds of times the force of gravity, a level of physical shock that would instantly shatter almost any piece of delicate electronic equipment that existed prior to this project anywhere in the world. The vacuum tubes used in ordinary radio equipment of this period, the kind you would find in any household radio receiver, are simply far too fragile in their internal construction to survive forces of this magnitude. Their delicate internal filaments and electrode structures, designed for equipment that would never experience anything more violent than being dropped from a table, would be destroyed instantly by the acceleration of being fired from a naval gun, rendering the entire fuse completely inert before it had even left the barrel. What this project requires, therefore, before we can even begin to address the more conceptually interesting problem of building a functional proximity sensing radio circuit, is an entirely new generation of vacuum tube, engineered from the ground up with internal structures rugged enough to survive gun launch forces that no vacuum tube manufacturer anywhere in the world had any previous occasion to design for. Because no previous application had ever required delicate electronic components to survive being fired from an artillery piece in the first place. The solution, developed over the following months through a painstaking process of iterative redesign and testing that Walter participated in directly, involved a fundamental reconsideration of vacuum tube construction. Internal electrode structures reinforced and repositioned to distribute the shock of firing more evenly. Filament mountings redesigned to eliminate the delicate, easily shattered support structures that ordinary radio tubes relied upon. And an entirely new manufacturing and quality control process specifically developed to identify and reject the small fraction of tubes whose internal construction, however carefully manufactured, remained too fragile to reliably survive the specific violence of gun launch. We tested these early tube designs, Walter recalled, in an account he eventually set down many decades later, using a specially constructed air gun capable of simulating the acceleration forces of an actual artillery launch, without the cost and complexity of firing an actual naval gun for every single test iteration. I spent the better part of 8 months across that first year of the project, watching tube after tube, design after design, shatter or fail internally under simulated launch forces, each failure providing data that fed into a slightly modified design for the following test, in a process of patient, incremental refinement that felt, at the time, almost unbearably slow, and that I have come, in retrospect, to regard as one of the more genuinely remarkable examples of rapid wartime engineering innovation that the entire conflict produced, however unglamorous and however invisible to any wider public audience. This particular piece of the war's technical history has generally remained. What the fuse actually detected. It was Dr. Voss who eventually explained to Walter, in sufficient technical detail for him to genuinely grasp the underlying physics, rather than simply following procedural instructions he did not fully understand, precisely how the completed fuse's proximity sensing mechanism actually worked. A mechanism whose basic principle, once explained clearly, struck Walter as considerably more elegant than the sheer scale of the engineering challenge required to actually build it had initially suggested. The fuse, once armed, continuously broadcasts a weak radio signal from a small antenna built into the shell's nose, Dr. Voss explained. As the shell approaches any solid object, most usefully, for our purposes, the metal fuselage and wings of an enemy aircraft, a portion of that broadcast signal reflects back toward the shell, in a manner not unlike the echo of a shout returning from a nearby cliff face. The fuse's internal receiver detects this returning echo, and this is the genuinely clever part of the underlying design, and the part that required the most careful engineering to make reliably functional. Measures the specific pattern of interference created when the shell's own outgoing signal and the returning echo signal overlap and interact with one another. As the shell draws closer to the target aircraft, this interference pattern changes in a predictable, mathematically describable way, and the fuse's internal circuitry is designed to recognize the specific pattern that indicates the shell has reached the point of closest practical approach to the target. The precise moment, in other words, when detonating the shell's explosive charge will produce the maximum possible destructive effect from the resulting fragmentation pattern. Since anti-aircraft shells of this era relied on scattering a wide field of metal fragments outward from the detonation point, rather than on any direct impact with the target itself. What makes this approach so significant compared to every previous generation of anti-aircraft ammunition is that it requires no advanced calculation of the target's actual distance, speed, or heading at all. A TR. Additional timed fuse must be set before firing based on an estimate of exactly when the shell will reach the target's position. An estimate that depends on the gun crew accurately judging the target aircraft's current range, speed, and likely evasive maneuvering, all under the genuinely chaotic conditions of actual combat, where enemy aircraft are, by design and necessity, doing everything within their own power to make exactly this kind of advanced calculation as difficult and as unreliable as possible. Our fuse requires no such advanced estimate at all. It simply detects, in real time, using nothing but the shell's own broadcast signal and the physics of radio wave reflection, the actual moment of closest approach to whatever solid object happens to be nearby, a moment that occurs and is correctly detected, regardless of how badly any advance estimate of the target's position might have been wrong. The first combat trials. The fuse's first genuine combat deployment came in early 1943, aboard a small number of United States Navy warships operating in the Pacific Theater, where the project's planners had determined that the risk of a dud shell falling into enemy hands and being recovered for reverse engineering purposes was considerably lower than it would be in the more geographically constrained European theater, a calculation that would, over the following 2 years, come to shape nearly every operational restriction placed on the weapon's use. I was not present for those first combat trials myself, Walter wrote in his own later account, having remained throughout this period in the considerably less dramatic environment of the Washington Naval Gun Factory's testing and development facilities. But I received, through the careful, heavily restricted internal reporting channels available to those of us who had worked on the project's development, an account of the fuse's first genuinely successful combat engagement that struck me, even reading it second-hand in a dry technical report, as a moment of considerable and quiet vindication for the 2 years of painstaking, often frustrating engineering work that had preceded it. A Japanese aircraft, engaging one of the small number of ships equipped with the new fuse during a routine patrol action, was destroyed by anti-aircraft fire that the ship's own gunnery officer described in his after-action report as producing an unusually precise and unusually effective burst pattern, the shell detonating, in his professional assessment, at almost exactly the optimal distance from the target aircraft to maximize the destructive effect of its fragmentation pattern. A level of precision that ordinary timed fuse ammunition, dependent on advanced range estimation under combat conditions, only rarely achieved even under the most favorable circumstances. It was, by any reasonable measure, an almost unremarkable single engagement in the vast scale of the entire Pacific War, a single enemy aircraft destroyed by a single anti-aircraft shell, an event of the kind that occurred in less dramatic form many thousands of times across the full span of that conflict. But it represented, for those of us who had spent 2 years solving the specific engineering problems that had made this single successful engagement possible, a moment of genuine and considerable professional satisfaction. The restriction that nearly cost the project its purpose. It was in the months following these initial successful combat trials that Walter first encountered, directly, and with a frustration he found genuinely difficult to reconcile with his own understanding of the weapon's obvious tactical value, the specific and deliberately restrictive operational policy that would govern the fuse's use for the following 2 years of the war. The policy, as it was explained to those of us working on the project's continued development, was straightforward in its stated logic, even as it struck many of us, at the time, as a genuinely frustrating limitation on a weapon we believed could make an immediate and significant difference in a great many combat situations where it was, for the time being, deliberately withheld, Walter recounted. The fuse was to be used only in combat situations where the risk of an unexploded shell falling into enemy hands and being recovered intact was judged to be acceptably low, meaning, in practical terms, naval engagements at sea, where a dud shell would almost certainly sink beyond any practical recovery effort, and for a period, certain Pacific Island combat situations where the terrain and tactical circumstances made enemy recovery of unexploded ordnance similarly unlikely. The fuse was explicitly and absolutely prohibited throughout this entire period from any use over European land territory, where the far greater density of German technical intelligence resources, combined with the simple geographic reality of fighting across contested and frequently changing front lines, made the risk of an unexploded shell falling into German hands and being recovered and analyzed by German engineers fully capable of reverse engineering its underlying technology, considered entirely unacceptable by the senior officers responsible for the weapon's overall security. I want to be honest, in setting down this account so many decades after the fact, about how genuinely frustrating this restriction felt to a number of us working on the project during this period, watching reports of German V-1 flying bomb attacks against London and other British cities, and understanding, with a clarity that felt almost unbearable at the time, that the proximity fuse we had spent years developing was very likely capable of dramatically improving the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire against exactly this kind of fast, low-flying target, and that this capability was being deliberately withheld from use in exactly the theater where it might have provided the most immediate and dramatic humanitarian benefit, purely out of legitimate, but nonetheless frustrating concern for the weapon's continued technical secrecy. The V-1 crisis. The tension between the fuse's obvious tactical value against precisely the kind of target the German V-1 flying bomb represented, and the strict operational restrictions preventing its use in the European theater came to a genuine crisis point in the summer of 1944, when Germany began launching sustained V-1 attacks against London and southern England, presenting British and American anti-aircraft defenses with a genuinely novel and genuinely difficult targeting problem that conventional timed fuse ammunition proved frustratingly ill-suited to address. The V-1 presented anti-aircraft gunners with a target profile considerably different from a conventional piloted aircraft. Dr. Voss explained, in a technical briefing Walter attended during this period, as pressure mounted within the project to reconsider the existing restrictions. It flew a relatively low, fast, and consistent flight path, but its small size and the sheer speed of its approach made it an extraordinarily difficult target for gun crews attempting to calculate, under real combat time pressure, the correct advance range estimate that conventional timed fuse ammunition required for effective use. Early combat statistics from the initial weeks of the V-1 campaign showed anti-aircraft gunners achieving only a modest success rate against these targets using conventional ammunition, a rate that, given the genuine civilian devastation each successfully arriving V-1 was causing in London and the surrounding region, represented a genuinely urgent operational problem that senior commanders on the ground were increasingly, and quite understandably, pressing to have addressed by whatever technical means were actually available. The decision, eventually reached at a level of senior military and political authority considerably above the project's own technical staff, to authorize limited deployment of the proximity fuse against V-1 targets specifically, a decision that required weighing the ongoing risk of technical compromise against the genuine and mounting civilian cost of continued V-1 attacks, represented, Walter later reflected, one of the more consequential and genuinely difficult strategic judgments of the entire European air campaign. The reasoning that ultimately prevailed, as it was explained to those of us following these developments from our own more technical vantage point, rested on a calculation that I have come, across many subsequent decades of reflection, to regard as a genuinely sound piece of strategic judgment, however difficult it must have been to reach at the time, Walter wrote. V-1 flying bombs, unlike conventional aircraft, generally crashed and were destroyed upon reaching the end of their programmed flight, whether intercepted or not, meaning that any unexploded proximity-fused shell fired at a V-1 and missing its target would very likely fall into the English countryside or the sea, in territory under secure British control, rather than into any German-held territory where recovery and reverse engineering by German engineers might actually occur. This specific tactical circumstance, engaging a target whose own flight path carried it consistently over friendly controlled territory, regardless of whether interception succeeded, substantially reduced the security risk that had governed the fuse's restriction in every other European combat context. And it was this specific and carefully reasoned distinction, rather than any general relaxation of the underlying security concern, that finally permitted the weapon's deployment against precisely the target it had, in retrospect, always seemed particularly well suited to address. What the statistics eventually showed. The results of this limited but genuinely significant deployment, once properly compiled and analyzed by Anti-Aircraft Command. Statisticians in the weeks following its authorization confirmed dramatically the tactical advantage that Walter and his colleagues had long believed the fuse would provide against exactly this kind of fast, low-flying target. The improvement in interception effectiveness, once the proximity fuse was authorized for use against V1 targets, was substantial enough that even senior commanders who had, quite reasonably, remained cautious about the weapon's premature exposure to any risk of German recovery, found themselves genuinely persuaded of the calculation's soundness, Walter recounted. Anti-aircraft batteries equipped with the new fuse began achieving success rates against V1 targets several times higher than those achieved by conventional ammunition, a statistical improvement that translated in the most direct and human terms available into a substantial and measurable reduction in the number of V1 flying bombs actually reaching London and the surrounding civilian population in the final months before Allied forces succeeded in overrunning the launch sites themselves. I have thought a great deal across the many decades since about the particular and rather uncomfortable moral arithmetic embedded in this entire episode. The fact that a weapon capable of providing this substantial a reduction in civilian casualties had been deliberately withheld from exactly this application for over a year, for reasons of technical security that I still believe, on balance, were reasonably and defensibly judged at the time. But that nonetheless meant a considerable number of V1 attacks succeeded in reaching their targets during that earlier period that might, in principle, have been intercepted had the security calculus been weighed slightly differently. I do not believe there is any way to resolve this particular tension with full moral comfort, and I have come, in my own later years, to regard it as one of the more genuinely difficult and instructive examples, from the whole of that war's technical history, of how thoroughly military secrecy and immediate humanitarian benefit can come into genuine and painful conflict, with no available choice that avoids real cost in one direction or the other. The Battle of the Bulge. It was several months later, in the winter of 1944, during the desperate and chaotic fighting of what would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, that the proximity fuse finally received authorization for its first genuinely widespread use in ground combat over European land territory, a decision driven by the sheer scale and urgency of the crisis German forces had created through their surprise winter offensive, and the recognition at the highest levels of Allied command that the fuse's proven effectiveness against ground troops caught in the open, where its ability to detonate reliably above ground level regardless of terrain or advance range estimation, offered a substantial tactical advantage over conventional timed or impact-fused artillery ammunition, represented an advantage too significant to continue withholding, given the genuine crisis the German offensive had created. The fuse, deployed in this new ground combat application, proved devastatingly effective against German infantry caught in the open during the chaotic fighting of that particular winter. Walter recounted, drawing on both his own technical understanding of the weapon and the subsequent historical accounts that emerged after the war's end. Artillery shells equipped with the proximity fuse, rather than requiring impact with the ground or a precisely calculated timed detonation to achieve their destructive effect, would instead detonate automatically at an optimal height above the ground, the moment their radio reflection sensing circuitry detected the terrain approaching, producing a devastating airburst effect over enemy troops in open ground or shallow foxholes that conventional ground impact artillery fire, by comparison, often failed to achieve with anything like the same consistency, since a shell that struck open ground directly frequently dissipated much of its destructive energy downward and outward across the ground's surface, rather than delivering the more consistently lethal overhead airburst pattern that the proximity fuse reliably produced regardless of the specific terrain or ground conditions at any given location. Senior American commanders in this theater, in after-action reports that were compiled and analyzed once the immediate crisis of the German offensive had passed, described the proximity-fused artillery fire deployed during this battle as having a significant, and in the assessment of several field commanders, genuinely decisive impact on halting and eventually reversing specific German advances during the most critical and uncertain days of the entire engagement, though I want to be careful in recounting this, not to suggest that any single weapon, however effective, was solely responsible for the eventual Allied success in that battle, which depended, as every genuine military historian of that engagement has properly emphasized, on an enormous combination of factors including logistics, air power, infantry endurance, and the simple, extraordinary courage of soldiers fighting under genuinely brutal winter conditions against a determined and initially successful German surprise offensive. What the enemy never learned. It was a detail that Walter himself did not fully appreciate until many years after the war's end, confirmed through subsequent historical research into captured German technical intelligence records, that despite the fuse's extensive deployment during the final year of the European War, German engineers never succeeded in obtaining a sufficiently intact example to reverse engineer the underlying technology, a genuine vindication in retrospect. of the extended period of restricted deployment that had frustrated Walter and his colleagues so considerably during the earlier years of the project. I learned many decades after the war from historical research that had by then gained access to captured German technical intelligence files. Walter wrote that German ordnance engineers had in fact recovered a small number of unexploded American artillery shells during the fighting in the winter of 1944 and 1945, and had subjected at least some of these recovered shells to technical examination in an effort to understand exactly what accounted for the unusually devastating airburst effect that German field commanders had, by this point in the war, begun reporting with increasing alarm in their own after-action assessments. What these German examinations apparently failed to achieve, based on the surviving records historians have subsequently been able to study, was a sufficiently complete recovery of any single fuse's internal components to permit genuine reverse engineering of the underlying radio sensing technology. Whether because the specific shells recovered had already detonated in a manner that destroyed the delicate internal circuitry beyond useful examination, or because the sheer novelty and sophistication of the underlying miniaturized radio technology proved genuinely difficult for German engineers to properly understand and reconstruct, even from whatever fragments they did manage to recover, remains, so far as I am aware, not entirely settled by the surviving historical record. What I can say with confidence, based on everything the subsequent historical scholarship has established, is that Germany never succeeded, across the entire remaining span of the war, in developing or deploying any equivalent proximity fuse technology of its own, meaning that the extended period of careful, deliberately restrictive security practice that so frustrated many of us working on the project during its earlier years ultimately succeeded in its central purpose. Preserving this particular technical advantage exclusively for Allied use throughout the entire war, even as the weapon was eventually deployed in its final year across a considerably wider range of combat applications than the project's original planners had ever anticipated. A companion story of miniaturization. There is a related story connected to the proximity fuse project only through the shared broader history of wartime miniaturized electronics, rather than through any direct institutional connection, that Walter's own granddaughter, continuing by this point the now well-established tradition of historical research that had connected several other families through entirely separate corners of the same war, brought to his attention during her own graduate studies concerning the parallel and, in certain technical respects, even more demanding miniaturization challenges involved in early wartime radar development, a technology whose own history Walter found himself drawn into more deeply during his final years of active research into his own project's broader historical context. What strikes me most studying the broader history of wartime radio and radar technology alongside your own project-specific history, Walter's granddaughter told him, describing her research, is how thoroughly this entire period of the war represented a kind of hidden technological revolution, playing out largely in laboratories and workshops far removed from any actual battlefield. That nonetheless proved every bit as consequential to the war's eventual outcome as the more visible and more celebrated battles that fill the general historical record most people actually learn about. The proximity fuse, the code-breaking machines at Bletchley Park, the radar systems that gave British air defense crucial early warning during the Battle of Britain, the increasingly sophisticated radio and sonar equipment used in the long and difficult Battle of the Atlantic against German submarines. All of these represented, in their own distinct ways, a single broader story of miniaturized electronic technology developing at an extraordinary and genuinely unprecedented pace under the specific pressure of wartime necessity, in ways that would go on in the post-war decades that followed to shape the entire subsequent trajectory of civilian electronic and computing technology in ways that most people using the resulting devices then and now have very little occasion to trace back to their specific wartime origins. What Walter chose to remember. It was this observation, more than any single technical detail of his own project-specific history, that Walter found himself returning to most often in the final account he set down for his own family, in the last years of a long life that had, after the war's end, taken him into a lengthy and professionally rewarding career in civilian electronics research. A career he had, by his own honest later assessment, only ever fully appreciated as a direct continuation of the specific technical problems and specific engineering habits of mind that his wartime service had first taught him. I have thought a great deal, across these many decades since the war's end, about the peculiar and in some ways rather humbling nature of the specific contribution I was fortunate enough to make to that enormous conflict, Walter wrote. I did not storm any beach or fly any combat mission or endure any of the more visibly dramatic and more visibly dangerous experiences that so many other men and women of my own generation lived through during those same years. I spent the greater part of my own wartime service in a laboratory, testing vacuum tubes against simulated gun launch forces, refining circuit designs through countless iterations of failure and incremental improvement, in work that felt, at the time, considerably more tedious and considerably less dramatic than almost any other form of wartime service I could easily imagine. And yet I have come, across these many subsequent decades of reflection, to believe that this quieter, more technical, more thoroughly unglamorous form of wartime contribution mattered every bit as much, in its own specific and carefully bounded way, as the more visibly dramatic contributions of the soldiers and sailors and airmen whose stories fill the general histories of that war. a weapon that reliably destroyed enemy aircraft, and in its final year of deployment, devastated exposed enemy infantry with a consistency that conventional ammunition of that era simply could not match, was not invented by any single dramatic flash of insight, but through years of patient, careful, often genuinely frustrating engineering labor, conducted by a considerable number of scientists and engineers whose individual names, in most cases, remain entirely unknown to the general public even now, more than 80 years after the war's end. I would like my own grandchildren, reading this account, to understand that the war I helped fight, in my own small and specific corner of a genuinely enormous conflict, was won not merely by the courage of the men who fired the guns, but by the patient, often invisible labor of the considerably less celebrated men and women who spent years making certain those guns, when finally fired, would actually strike exactly what they were aimed at, a form of wartime service that receives, I think, considerably less popular recognition than it properly deserves, precisely because its actual achievements are so thoroughly technical, so thoroughly unglamorous, and so thoroughly invisible to anyone without the specific engineering background required to fully appreciate quite how difficult a problem had actually been solved. A note on what actually happened. The proximity fuse, formerly designated the VT, variable time, fuse, was a real and historically significant American wartime weapons technology, developed principally by the National Defense Research Committee and the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, beginning in 1940. Using a miniaturized radio transmitter and receiver housed within the artillery shell's nose, the fuse detected the reflected radio signal from a nearby target and detonated the shell automatically at the point of optimal proximity, eliminating the need for advanced range estimation required by conventional timed fuses. Its development required significant original engineering work, including the creation of specialized vacuum tubes rugged enough to survive the extreme acceleration forces of artillery gun launch. Due to concerns that an unexploded shell falling into enemy hands could allow reverse engineering of the technology, its use was strictly restricted for much of the war to naval combat at sea and selected Pacific theater engagements, where the risk of enemy recovery was considered low. This restriction was significantly relaxed in the summer of 1944 to permit the fuse's use against German V-1 flying bombs targeting Britain, a DISIS. I am informed by the calculation that V-1 flight paths carried them consistently over friendly controlled territory, and subsequent statistical analysis confirmed a substantial improvement in interception rates following this deployment. The fuse received its first major authorized use in ground combat during the Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944-1945, where its ability to produce reliable airburst detonations over open ground significantly increased the lethality of Allied artillery fire against exposed German infantry. and was credited by several field commanders as a significant factor in halting specific German advances during that engagement. Historical research into captured German records has found no evidence that German engineers succeeded in reverse engineering the technology before the war's end, confirming the effectiveness of the extended security restrictions that governed the weapons deployment throughout most of the conflict.